A racist woman stole Big Shaq's power to charge her Tesla. But Big Shaq didn't just wait. He rewrote the rules. What started as quiet entitlement sparked a public reckoning. In a lot full of silence, Big Shaq turned patience into power. This wasn't about a charger. This was about shifting the current. And when Big Shaq struck back, it wasn't revenge. It was a shocking payback the world couldn't ignore. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement as Shaquille O'Neal pulled his electric SUV into the nearly deserted charging station. The place was oddly quiet, the usual hum of traffic softened by the thick line of palms swaying in the humid breeze. Shaq eased his large frame out of the driver's seat, sunglasses slipping down his nose. As he glanced toward the charging ports, only one was working. A flashing green light signaled its availability. As he approached, his phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. This was supposed to be a simple stop on the way to a charity event. Shaq inhaled deeply, stretching his broad shoulders, when a sleek black Tesla glided in from the far end of the lot. Without so much as a turn signal or glance, the car sliced across 2 lanes and parked squarely in front of the charger. Shaq paused, blinking behind his sunglasses. The Tesla's driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman in her late 40s, thin, sharp-featured, and unmistakably dressed to be noticed. Tailored designer coat, pearl earrings that caught the sun, and a determined, almost clipped gait. Her hair was pinned back with clinical precision, her lips set in a taut line as she pulled out her phone and began tapping away, eyes flicking up just long enough to glance at Shaq. Their gazes met for a split second. She smirked. Shaq shifted his weight, his 6'11" frame casting a long shadow across the lot. He took a measured step forward, hands relaxed at his sides. The picture of calm. "Afternoon," he rumbled with a nod, his voice low but warm. The woman, Cassandra Green, though he wouldn't learn her name yet, offered nothing in return. Not a nod, not a smile. Instead, she flicked her eyes back to her phone, adjusted her sunglasses, and plugged in her Tesla, the cord locking into place with a click. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had seen this dance before, the subtle choreography of avoidance and dismissal. It wasn't just about a charger, it was about claiming space, about making sure someone like him was reminded of the limits some wanted to impose, even here, on a sunny Florida afternoon. He pulled out his phone and checked the map. The next nearest charging station was 12 miles away, nearly out of reach on his current battery. His stomach tightened, not from anger, but from the familiar ache of frustration. Still, he forced his shoulders to stay loose, his stance open. "Hey there," he said gently, stepping a little closer, careful not to loom. "Mind letting me know when you're done? I'm kinda on a tight clock." Cassandra barely tilted her head. "First come, first served," she murmured, her voice cool as glass. The words hit harder than they should have. Shaq stood there for a moment, letting the breeze brush against his skin, tasting the quiet insult beneath her civility. He remembered his mother's voice in his head. "Baby, don't let small people shrink your spirit." He smiled softly at the memory, then pivoted away from Cassandra, walking back to lean against his SUV. It should have ended there, a minor inconvenience, a forgettable annoyance. But Shaq could feel something shifting in the air. A man walking his dog slowed as he passed, his eyes flicking between Shaq and Cassandra. A couple coming out of the cafe across the street paused by their car, openly watching the unfolding scene. Phones came out, subtle but unmistakable. Cassandra glanced up, noticing the spectators, and with a performative sigh, she raised her voice just enough. "I just don't feel comfortable with all this hovering." Shaq let the words wash over him, but inside something old and raw stirred. He folded his arms, breathing in through his nose. He didn't have to guess where this was going. He'd been here before. In boardrooms, in restaurants, in airports. The careful dance of privilege and performance. A security guard emerged from the nearby building, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Hey sir," the guard called out, his eyes trained on Shaq. "Everything okay here?" Shaq let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Everything's fine, brother," he answered smoothly. But the guard didn't move toward Cassandra or even glance her way. The crowd around the lot thickened slightly, whispers rippling outward. Some recognized Shaq, their eyes lighting up in surprise. Others just saw a massive black man, standing still while a white woman looked increasingly flustered by his presence. The tension in the air stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Shaq felt the familiar weight settle across his chest. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of exhausted patience. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone, opened a notepad app, and began typing quietly, a small plan forming in the back of his mind. As he typed, he glanced over at Cassandra, who was now pretending to scroll through her own phone while glancing up every few seconds, her posture radiating smugness. She had claimed the charger, claimed the narrative, and now she bathed in the quiet satisfaction of being right. But what she hadn't counted on, what people like her rarely counted on, was the power of someone like Shaq choosing not to play the part she had written for him. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the pavement. Shaq straightened, feeling his back loosen as he tucked away his phone. His SUV sat silent behind him, a massive presence that, like its owner, waited without complaint. He could feel the eyes on him, the murmur of bystanders weighing sympathy, discomfort, and judgment. Inside, Shaq touched the edge of old hurts, not to fuel rage, but to remind himself of why he carried himself the way he did. This wasn't new, this wasn't surprising, but it was still, in its own small way, heartbreaking. He closed his eyes for a beat, exhaling through his nose, steady and sure. When his eyes opened, they flicked once more to Cassandra. She was laughing now into her phone, gesturing broadly, the image of someone in control. But a storm was already gathering, not in fists or fury, but in something far more unsettling. Consequence. And though she didn't know it yet, Cassandra Green was about to learn just how electrifying Shaq's patience could be. The Florida sun was unrelenting, beating down on the asphalt, as Shaq leaned against his SUV, arms folded loosely across his chest, watching Cassandra Green from behind his sunglasses. From the outside, it might have looked like a man casually waiting his turn. But inside, the tension was coiling tighter, a quiet storm gathering beneath his skin. Cassandra stood at the charger with a posture that screamed ownership, casually tossing her blonde hair back as she laughed into her phone. Shaq caught bits of her conversation floating over the warm air, phrases like "some people just don't respect the rules," and "you never know these days who's hanging around public places." The coded language wasn't lost on him. Cassandra paced a small circle near her Tesla, voice lifted just enough for anyone nearby to catch the tone, if not the exact words. Shaq watched as pedestrians slowed their steps, sensing the charged atmosphere. A woman pushing a stroller paused at the edge of the lot, glancing between the towering figure of Shaq and the well-dressed Cassandra with a look of mild concern. Across the street, a man on a bicycle circled twice, pretending to check his phone while recording under the guise of texting. The quiet stage had become a public theater, and Cassandra seemed to relish her role. Shaq took a deep breath, remembering his mother's lessons about patience and presence. Lucille's voice came back to him, like a hymn. "You don't have to match their noise, baby. Let your quiet show them their own reflection." But today, that reflection was turning uglier by the minute. Cassandra flicked another glance at Shaq, barely suppressing a smile, and raised her phone to snap a selfie in front of her Tesla. He caught the corner of her smirk, the way she angled the camera to capture the scene, not just her car but Shaq's looming figure blurred in the background. The message was unmistakable: "Look who I'm dealing with." For a brief moment, Shaq considered simply walking away. Let her have the charger. Let her win the petty battle. But as his eyes moved across the small gathering crowd, he realized this wasn't just about him. This was about every person who'd ever been shoved to the margins, every moment when someone's worth was weighed against another's comfort. He stayed rooted, his silence a statement in itself. Cassandra's microaggressions grew bolder. She lowered her phone and murmured something into her AirPods, glancing conspicuously at Shaq before shaking her head in an exaggerated gesture of disapproval. Her body language screamed discomfort, though Shaq hadn't taken a step toward her. When a pair of teenagers walked by, Cassandra leaned slightly toward them, lips curling in an expression of theatrical unease. Shaq could almost hear the narrative forming in her head: the lone woman, the threatening stranger, the need for protection. Yet Shaq remained still, watching her with the calm of someone who'd weathered far worse storms. His patience was not passivity. It was armor. He had built it over decades, from childhood courts to NBA arenas, from TV sets to boardrooms. This woman didn't know it, but she was playing a game with a man who had already mastered it. A white SUV pulled into the lot. slowing as the driver's eyes darted between Cassandra and Shaq. The passenger window rolled down slightly before rolling up again, and the car parked at the far end, well away from the scene. Shaq felt the sting of the silent calculation. It was always there, the quiet math people did. Threat or neighbor, danger or celebrity, headline or hero. He exhaled slowly, anchoring himself in the moment. Cassandra checked her charging progress, sighed dramatically, and called out loud enough for Shaq to hear. These stations really should limit how long people can hang around. It's uncomfortable for everyone. The words weren't directed at him, but they hung in the air between them like barbed wire. Shaq felt the weight of them, not just as an insult, but as an accusation. A sharp whistle broke the tension as a group of delivery drivers on electric scooters zipped by, laughing and calling to each other. For a brief moment, the scene felt lighter, the world reminding itself that joy could still exist on the margins. But as quickly as they came, the scooters disappeared, leaving the quiet heaviness behind. Shaq adjusted his stance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and caught sight of his reflection in the SUV window. There he was. Big Shaq, the big Aristotle, the larger-than-life figure so many adored. And yet here in this parking lot, he was reduced to just another black man waiting for a chance he'd already earned. He felt the paradox press against his chest, both familiar and infuriating. Cassandra moved to her car, pretending to check something in the back seat while sneaking another glance at Shaq. Her voice floated over the car roof, aimed at no one in particular. It's just you'd think people would understand boundaries. Shaq met her gaze briefly, and something flickered in her expression, a flash of nervousness, perhaps realizing that the performance she'd orchestrated was beginning to attract attention she hadn't anticipated. A man in his 50s, wearing a faded baseball cap and jeans, approached Shaq cautiously. "Hey, big man," he said quietly, nodding toward the scene. "Need me to say something?" Shaq shook his head, with a small grateful smile. "Nah, I got it, man," he murmured. The man gave a thumbs up, and retreated, blending back into the crowd. Even in moments of division, Shaq was reminded, there were still quiet allies in the mix. As the minutes dragged on, Cassandra's composure began to crack. Her glances toward Shaq grew more frequent, her fingers drumming impatiently on her phone. She looked up suddenly, noticing the growing number of onlookers now openly filming. The tension she had cultivated so carefully was beginning to tilt, the narrative shifting under her feet. What had started as a display of dominance was becoming something far less flattering. Shaq could sense it. The slow pivot, the realization dawning in Cassandra's eyes, that she was no longer the protagonist of this story. The weight of public scrutiny began to press against her, and for the first time that afternoon, her confidence wavered. He let the silence stretch, let her feel the absence of confrontation. Sometimes he knew, the most powerful response was the one never given. As Cassandra's Tesla beeped, signaling a full charge, she hesitated, as if unsure whether to stay or flee. Shaq offered her a small, polite nod, the barest acknowledgement of her presence, then turned to check his phone. The plan he had set in motion was already unfolding in the background. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And though Cassandra didn't know it yet, her afternoon of entitlement was about to collide with a reckoning she couldn't control. What should have been a quiet afternoon at a suburban Florida charging station was slowly turning into a public spectacle. Shaq could feel it before he saw it, the shift in energy, the gathering of eyes. It started with the subtle slowing of footsteps, the way a jogger passed once and then circled back under the pretense of adjusting her watch. Cars that would have normally rolled past began lingering near the entrance, their drivers pretending to check directions or make calls while their eyes flicked toward the parking lot drama. Cassandra, still standing near her Tesla with the charger snugly locked in place, seemed oblivious to the slow shift, or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, her performance was sharpening. Shaq remained where he was, leaning against his SUV, his figure unmistakable, his patience remarkable. Yet in the eyes of the unfamiliar, his stillness was not seen as grace, but as potential threat. Shaq could read it in the nervous glances, the hesitant steps, the way people clutched their bags just a little tighter when passing by. The whispers began to ripple, soft at first, then swelling as recognition spread. Some saw a celebrity, a legend, the man they remembered dunking over giants and making crowds roar. Others saw only a large black man standing too close to an anxious white woman, and that old American script began to write itself in the minds of strangers. A young man wearing a baseball cap and mirrored sunglasses muttered to his companion, "Is that Shaq?" The companion squinted, then shook his head, as if unwilling to believe that the towering figure before them was anything more than trouble. A woman in yoga gear raised her phone, halfway pretending to check a text but slyly angling the camera toward the lot. Shaq caught the flicker of a red recording light, and the knot in his chest tightened, not from fear but from the weight of knowing how quickly a story could spiral when told without context. Cassandra upped her game. She paced near her car, voice rising into the air as she spoke into her phone. "I just don't know what to do," she said loudly, her tone carefully laced with distress. "He's been standing there this whole time. It's making me really uncomfortable. Should I call someone?" The words were crafted like darts, tossed not just at the person on the other end of her line, but at every bystander within earshot. Shaq could feel the shift immediately, the way people stiffened, how the air itself seemed to sharpen. He clenched his jaw briefly, but kept his body relaxed, his mother's voice echoing in his head like an old gospel refrain. "Hold steady, baby. Hold steady." That's when the security guard appeared, emerging from the glass doors of a nearby coffee shop, adjusting his belt and scanning the lot with a frown. He was young, probably early 20s, his uniform crisp but his eyes uncertain. Shaq watched him approach, felt the tightening of the moment as if the air itself had thickened. The guard's steps slowed as he neared, his gaze darting between Cassandra, who was waving at him with palpable relief, and Shaq, who offered a small, measured nod. "Sir, is everything okay here?" the guard asked, his voice polite but edged with something wary. Shaq took a slow breath, measured and deep, and straightened from his relaxed stance. He smiled softly, a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "All good, brother," he rumbled, voice calm as still water. The guard shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure. Cassandra swept in quickly. "I've just been feeling very unsafe," she said, her voice trembling in a way that sounded carefully rehearsed. "I don't know what's going on, but it's been a long time, and I'm just really uncomfortable." Shaq felt the words hit like pebbles against steel. He stood there, hands in plain sight, the image of calm control, yet he could feel the narrative tightening around him like an invisible noose. The crowd watched, murmuring, eyes flicking between the players on this small stage, their own judgments rippling through the air like static. Then, like a crack of light through the clouds, a voice rose from the back of the crowd. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," someone said, half laughing, half incredulous. Heads turned, and recognition bloomed like wildfire. There was a sudden change in posture, a shift in tone. The man people were bracing against transformed, almost instantly, into the celebrity they admired. Whispers turned to murmurs of excitement, phones were raised, and smiles flickered to light. Shaq, however, felt none of the relief that recognition was supposed to bring. Instead, there was a bittersweet pang, the realization that his humanity was only acknowledged when wrapped in fame. The weight of that understanding pressed heavy on his chest. He gave a small wave to the murmuring crowd, a quiet gesture of acknowledgement, and offered the security guard a soft pat on the shoulder. "It's all good," Shaq said again, this time more firmly. The guard, clearly relieved, nodded and took a step back. Cassandra, on the other hand, looked rattled, her calculated discomfort crumbling at the edges as the crowd's sympathy drifted away from her. Amid the chaos, Shaq caught the eye of an older woman standing at the edge of the lot. She was dressed simply, grocery bags hanging from her arms, her lined face marked by something different from the rest. Understanding. She gave Shaq the smallest of nods, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. In that moment, Shaq felt a flicker of affirmation that steadied him in the storm. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the pavement. As the crowd thickened, some people moved closer, asking for selfies, while others just watched, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. Cassandra, visibly flustered now, glanced down at her phone, fingers tapping furiously as she pretended to ignore the shift in attention. Shaq remained still, his tall frame steady, his patience intact. Yet inside, the quiet ache gnawed at him. The ache of knowing how quickly people's perceptions could pivot, how little it took to become either threat or hero in the public eye. As the security guard retreated, and the crowd murmured excitedly, Shaq turned his gaze back to Cassandra. She looked up sharply, meeting his eyes for the first real time that afternoon. There was no smirk now, no carefully composed expression. Instead, there was something raw flickering, just behind her eyes, a crack in the polished facade, a tiny tremor of realization that she was losing control of the story. Shaq smiled softly, a gentle curve of his lips that spoke of both grace and quiet resolve. He knew now that the afternoon had taken a turn Cassandra hadn't anticipated, that the balance of power had subtly but decisively shifted. And while the crowd may have gathered in curiosity, their presence would soon become something Cassandra couldn't spin, couldn't charm her way out of. As the sun dipped lower, and the lot buzzed with whispers and laughter, Shaq let the moment settle. No need to rush. No need to push. The tide was turning on its own, and Cassandra Green, for the first time that day, looked genuinely afraid. Not of Shaq, but of the story slipping from her perfectly manicured grasp. As the crowd's restless energy hummed in the background, and Cassandra fumbled with her phone, Shaq stood perfectly still, a monument of calm amid the swirl of tension. But inside, far beneath the practiced smile and composed stance, the past stirred like a silent undertow. Shaq had mastered the art of being larger than life, of wearing humor like armor and charm like a shield. Yet behind it all were scars no trophy, no endorsement deal, no late-night talk show appearance could erase. His mind drifted, unbidden, to a memory that had never quite softened with time. He was 13, long-limbed and awkward, towering over classmates on a basketball court in Newark. He remembered the sharp sting of a coach's words, "Calm down, big guy, don't scare the little ones," as if his very presence was a threat, as if his body was something to apologize for. Back then, Shaq had learned that his size came with rules. Be gentle, be funny, be harmless, or risk being seen as dangerous. Lucille had been his anchor, the steady force that taught him not just how to rise, but how to rise right. He could still hear her voice in his head, as if she were standing beside him now. "Baby, they're gonna look at you and see what they want to see. You gotta show them who you are before they make you something you're not." She raised him to carry himself with dignity, to use his strength not to overpower but to uplift. It was her voice that kept him grounded in moments like this, when the world's eyes turned suspicious, when strangers rushed to judgment, when patience became the highest form of rebellion. Shaq's gaze softened, as it drifted from Cassandra to the small cluster of kids standing at the edge of the lot, pointing toward him with wide eyes. They were too young to understand the layers of what was unfolding, but old enough to recognize a hero when they saw one. Their presence pulled him into another memory, one far closer to his heart. His daughter Mayra, barely 9 at the time, sitting on the edge of her bed with tears streaking her cheeks. She had come home from school that day shaken, not because of a bad grade or a playground fight, but because a classmate had told her she'd never be princess material. Shaq had sat beside her, his massive hands carefully brushing her hair back from her face. His voice soft but certain as he told her, "Baby girl, you don't need a crown to be royalty. You're born with it." But inside he had felt the same old helplessness claw at his chest. The ache of knowing that no matter how famous, how successful, how beloved he was, his children would still have to navigate a world quick to label, quick to dismiss. Back at the lot, the murmurs continued to swirl around him. But Shaq stayed rooted in the moment. Cassandra, perhaps sensing the shift in energy, began pacing again, her movements sharp and restless. She was unraveling, but Shaq refused to be the one to pull at the thread. That was the discipline Lucille had taught him, to know when to stand firm, and when to stand down. He had never been one for public confrontations, not because he lacked the words or the will, but because he understood the price of being misunderstood. As Shaq reflected on his journey, a vivid thread ran through it all, the countless moments on and off the court when he had been underestimated, dismissed, or pigeonholed, from coaches who saw him as brute force before they saw his intellect, to business partners who expected a mascot not a strategist, to media figures who reduced him to a punchline. Yet at every turn Shaq had chosen to expand, not contract. He had learned to walk into rooms with shoulders square and head high, not as an act of defiance but as a declaration of presence. Cassandra's petty provocations weren't just an isolated act of entitlement. They were a reminder of the fragile dance so many were forced to perform every day. The balancing act between visibility and safety, between presence and peace. Shaq knew that had he been anyone else, someone without fame or cameras or a public legacy, this scene could have played out very differently. It was a sobering thought, one that pressed heavier on his heart than the Florida sun ever could. He thought again of Miara and his other children, of the world they were inheriting, and the lessons he still needed to impart. It wasn't enough to tell them to be strong, to be good, to rise above. He needed to show them what grace, under pressure, looked like. And that meant standing here, in this moment, holding his ground not with fists or fury, but with the quiet power of restraint. As Cassandra's voice wavered, as the crowd leaned in with curiosity tinged by unease, Shaq felt a flicker of resolve light inside him. He knew he could end this scene with a single comment, with a flash of anger or even a sharp joke that would land like a punchline. But that wasn't the victory he wanted. He didn't want to win the moment. He wanted to elevate it. The weight of history hung invisibly over the lot, a tapestry of moments like this, stretched across generations. Shaq knew his part in it, understood the responsibility that came with his platform. He wasn't just an athlete or a celebrity, or even a father in this moment. He was a symbol, a living contradiction to the prejudices being projected onto him. A car horn sounded in the distance, momentarily breaking the spell. Shaq's lips curved into a small, knowing smile as he drew a steadying breath. He adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders back, feeling the familiar ache in his knees. A reminder of the years, the battles, the miles he had traveled to become the man he was. And in that quiet, he reminded himself of something Lucille had once whispered to him after a hard game. A phrase he now carried like a talisman. Dignity doesn't bow to smallness, baby. It makes smallness stand alone. As the sun dipped lower, casting a soft amber glow across the lot, Shaq stood tall, a man shaped by scars but defined by grace. And as Cassandra's facade cracked and the crowd leaned ever closer, he knew that the most important lesson of the day wasn't for the cameras, or the strangers, or even for Cassandra. It was for himself, and for every quiet observer watching from the sidelines. The reminder that real power wasn't measured in wins or retweets or viral moments. It was measured in the unwavering choice to be more than what the world expected. Shaq felt the weight of the afternoon pressing against his chest. But what stirred inside him wasn't frustration. It was strategy. His calm patience was not the same as surrender. Cassandra sat smugly in her Tesla, occasionally glancing in his direction with an expression that wavered between superiority and self-satisfaction. She adjusted the rearview mirror, touched up her lipstick and scrolled her phone, the embodiment of someone convinced she had won. But as Shaq watched the scene unfold, he felt the flicker of something old and familiar, his mother Lucille's words rising like a quiet drumbeat in his chest. If they expect you to shrink, expand. Pulling his phone from his pocket, Shaq stepped back toward his SUV with an ease that made the small crowd relax. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, a call placed to a familiar number, the director of the local youth charity he had supported for years. He explained the situation in just a few words, and on the other end of the line, there was no hesitation. Within minutes, a plan was set in motion, and as Shaq hung up, a slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't going to end the way Cassandra thought. Cassandra continued her performance, occasionally lifting her chin to make sure the onlookers were still paying attention. But something subtle was shifting in the crowd. Conversations had turned from sharp whispers about the conflict to murmurs of recognition and curiosity. A few people edged closer to Shaq, offering nods of quiet support, their cell phones now pointed not at Cassandra's display of entitlement, but at Shaq's quiet composure. Without raising his voice or lifting a finger, he was changing the temperature of the moment. Then, as if on cue, a distant rumble drifted into the lot. The first truck, a white box van marked with the logo of the youth center, rolled into view, followed by another, and then a third. Bystanders turned to watch, curiosity flaring, as the trucks pulled up along the lot's edge, engines idling. Shaq moved to greet the drivers, clasping hands and exchanging a few quiet words. Out came volunteers, rolling carts stacked with bicycles, backpacks stuffed with school supplies, crates of fresh food, and bags of sports gear. The air shifted, and the small crowd instinctively drew back, watching as the scene transformed before their eyes. Cassandra leaned forward in her driver's seat, frowning in confusion as the volunteers unloaded box after box. Her gaze darted between Shaq and the unfolding activity, her earlier composure beginning to fray at the edges. The soft murmur of the crowd turned into a ripple of excitement as parents and children began arriving from the nearby community center, their faces lighting up as they realized what was happening. Shaq worked quietly, but efficiently, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped unload a stack of basketballs and passed them to a young volunteer. He moved through the lot with the grace of someone who knew his presence carried weight, but also knew how to redirect it towards something bigger than himself. As children ran toward the tables, laughing and calling out in delight, Shaq crouched beside them, ruffling hair, offering fist bumps, and exchanging warm smiles with parents. Cassandra, meanwhile, sat frozen in her Tesla, hands clenched around the steering wheel. Her once impenetrable bubble of entitlement now looked fragile, a glass sphere wobbling on the edge of collapse. She glanced at her phone, thumb hovering over the screen, as though unsure whether to call someone or simply drive away. But now her car was boxed in, hemmed by delivery vans, and surrounded by laughing kids, parents with strollers, and volunteers bustling between stations. She had built her stage on a narrow strip of pavement, and now the audience had turned their backs on her. Shaq felt the shift in energy and allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Not the petty triumph of one-upping Cassandra, but the deeper satisfaction of reclaiming the narrative. He could have lashed out, could have let anger spill into the scene, but instead he had redirected the moment into something no one could ignore. The crowd, once teetering between discomfort and curiosity, was now swept up in something joyful, purposeful, and unifying. The whispers about confrontation faded, replaced by laughter and gratitude. As he moved between tables, Shaq's gaze flicked to Cassandra just once, and what he saw there surprised even him. Her eyes, wide and darting, were no longer filled with disdain, but with something rawer, bewilderment, maybe even fear. For the first time that afternoon, she looked small, not because of Shaq's size, but because the stage she had claimed had been dismantled piece by piece, until she was no longer the center of the story. Shaq let the moment linger but didn't gloat. Instead, he focused on the families gathering in the lot, many of whom had come from neighborhoods that rarely saw this kind of abundance. A little girl wrapped her arms around his leg, and Shaq bent low to hug her back, laughter rumbling deep in his chest. Cameras clicked from every angle, but the focus was no longer on a standoff. It was on a community moment, on an unexpected gift that had turned an ugly afternoon into something unforgettable. Cassandra shifted in her seat, finally reaching for the ignition. But as she started the engine, the Tesla's navigation system flashed a warning. Charging incomplete. She glanced at the gauge, panic flashing across her face. The one thing she had claimed, the charger, had slipped away in the background noise of her crumbling control. Shaq caught her eyes in the rearview mirror, and for a heartbeat, the two locked in a wordless exchange, not anger, not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of how the ground had shifted beneath them both. A volunteer approached Shaq, handing him a clipboard with a grin. "You're a magician, man," the young man laughed. Shaq shook his head, smiling wide. "Nah," he said softly. "Just a little pivot." He moved back toward the crowd, blending seamlessly into the joy he had helped create, his frame now part of a scene so much larger than one afternoon's conflict. As the sun dipped lower and the last of the backpacks were handed out, Cassandra watched from behind the tinted glass of her car, her fingers frozen on the wheel. For all her maneuvering, she had been outpaced not by confrontation, but by kindness, a kind of power she had no script for, no defense against. And Shaq, the gentle giant she had tried to diminish, had risen above without ever needing to lower himself. In the end, the spark of Shaq's plan had set more than just a charity event in motion. It had upended the entire narrative, leaving the crowd, Cassandra, and even Shaq himself changed in ways none of them had seen coming. And as the lot slowly emptied, one truth hung unmistakably in the air. Patience, wielded wisely, was never weakness. It was the strongest play on the board. As the last of the volunteers unpacked boxes and set up tables, the sun bathed the lot in a warm golden glow, softening the hard edges of concrete and asphalt. But for Cassandra Green, the world was quickly losing its luster. Her fingers drummed nervously against the Tesla's steering wheel as she watched the flurry of movement around her, the excitement building as word spread. Children darted between tables with wide eyes and eager hands. Parents chatted gratefully with volunteers, and Shaq moved easily through the crowd, exchanging fist bumps, hugs, and laughter. Cassandra's charger was still plugged in, but the moment she'd claimed as her triumph had slipped away, drowned in the sound of community rising. She fidgeted in her seat, the once cool composure cracking at the edges. Cassandra stole a glance into the mirror, adjusting her sunglasses with a trembling hand as she caught sight of herself. Lipstick slightly smudged, hair no longer perfectly pinned, jaw clenched tight. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the charging station to become the backdrop for what was quickly evolving into a full-scale community event. And she definitely hadn't expected to be rendered invisible, outshone and outmaneuvered without a single word exchanged. The first media van arrived with a quiet hum, a local station that often covered human interest stories. But the moment the camera operator spotted Shaq among the crowd, their demeanor shifted, voices crackling excitedly through headsets, as they prepared to capture what was no longer just a neighborhood moment, but a celebrity story. One van became two, then three. News crews hurried to set up shots, capturing the sea of smiling faces, the flashing of camera phones, the towering figure of Shaq bending to tie a little boy's shoelace, or lift a crate of bottled water. Inside her Tesla, Cassandra's heart pounded. She shifted in her seat, debating whether to step out, to make herself part of the narrative, to reclaim some shred of control. But every time her hand reached for the door handle, she froze. What would she say? What role could she play now that her carefully constructed posture of control had dissolved? She peered out the window and caught a glimpse of her own reflection, eyes darting nervously, mouth pressed into a thin line. Then came the phones. The endless phones. Strangers who moments ago had been content to watch from the sidelines were now broadcasting live. The internet filling with real-time footage of Cassandra's unease. She overheard snippets as people walked by her window, voices sharp with incredulous laughter. "That's the woman, right? The one who blocked Shaq at the Charger? Oh, I'm already on the live stream. Look at the comments rolling in." A teenage girl with a high ponytail and a TikTok ring light clutched her phone gleefully, narrating the scene to an invisible audience. Cassandra shrank lower into her seat, pulse racing as she imagined her face spreading across screens, hashtags multiplying by the second. Shaq, meanwhile, was unbothered, perhaps even more focused than before. As a group of journalists approached, he greeted them with his signature grin, gesturing toward the tables overflowing with supplies. "We're just making sure the kids are set for school," he said simply, voice warm and easy. He didn't mention Cassandra. He didn't need to. Her part in the story was already being written by 1,000 thumbs racing across phone screens, by live streams and tweets, and grainy Instagram videos. Cassandra's attempt to start her car was met with an unpleasant realization. The Tesla's software informed her the battery was only at 42%, far short of the charge she'd assumed was underway. She'd been too busy posturing to notice the slow connection, too distracted by her own performance to realize the charger was faulty. Panic flickered across her face as she tapped the screen, navigating menus and settings, cursing softly under her breath. She yanked the charger free, hoping to quietly slip away, but found herself boxed in by the charity trucks, their doors flung open, tables stacked around them. For the first time that afternoon, Cassandra stepped out of the Tesla. Her designer flats clicked sharply against the pavement. As she approached one of the volunteers, trying to muster the authority she'd leaned on so easily before. "Excuse me," she said tightly. "I need to get out." But the volunteer, young, wearing a hoodie and ball cap, merely glanced up and gestured toward the trucks. "We'll be breaking down in a little bit, ma'am. Thanks for your patience." The words were polite, but the dismissal was unmistakable. That was when the meltdown began. Not the loud, table-flipping tantrum of viral stereotype, but something more brittle, more desperate. Cassandra's voice sharpened. Her hands fluttered. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson as she hissed under her breath. "This is unacceptable. Do you even know who I am?" The words barely cleared her throat before someone nearby caught them on camera. Laughter rising from the crowd, as Cassandra's frayed composure splintered fully apart. Within minutes, the live stream took on a life of its own. Tesla Karen trended locally. Snippets of her performance circulated with gleeful commentary. The sharp contrast between her entitlement and Shaq's calm generosity amplified by the internet's relentless appetite for comeuppance. Cassandra felt the ground tilt under her feet as a lifetime of careful curation. Her social media presence, her circle of status-conscious friends, her influencer persona, wobbled dangerously on the edge of collapse. And Shaq? He kept his back to the chaos, focusing on the small moments that mattered. A mother approached him, tears in her eyes as she thanked him for the school supplies. A group of boys clustered around, asking about basketball tips. An elderly man placed a gentle hand on Shaq's arm, murmuring quiet gratitude. In the background, Cassandra's spiral played out in fragments. Her raised voice, her frantic gestures, her eventual retreat back into the Tesla, where she sat trembling behind tinted glass. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the charging station had been transformed from a battleground of ego into a celebration of community. Volunteers handed out the last of the backpacks. Children clutched new soccer balls and skateboards, and families lingered to savor the unexpected abundance. Cassandra, drained and cornered, could do little more than watch as the narrative slipped fully away from her. As the trucks pulled out, leaving just enough room for the Tesla to edge free, Shaq finally glanced her way. Their eyes met, briefly, wordlessly, And in that moment, there was no gloating, no mockery, just the quiet, undeniable truth of a man who had chosen to meet smallness with greatness, pettiness with purpose. And as Cassandra drove away, her face pale and drawn, the story that remained was no longer hers to control. Cassandra Green awoke the next morning to a world she no longer recognized. Her phone, once a tool of control and connection, buzzed non-stop on the nightstand, its screen lighting up with a storm of missed calls, text messages, and notifications. She blinked into the early light, her throat dry, heart pounding, as fragments of the previous day clicked into place, her clipped voice echoing across the charging lot, the sea of strangers' eyes, the way Shaquille O'Neal's calm presence had swallowed the scene whole, and then the cameras, the phones, the live stream. She snatched her phone and scrolled. The hashtags hit like slaps: untesla tantrum, charger Karen, entitlement on camera, clips of her pacing, gesturing, her thin voice edged with impatience, each captured and stitched into viral montages. Her name trended across platforms she once ruled with carefully curated posts of fitness routines, wellness tips, and perfectly lit photos of avocado toast. But the comments now flooding her feed were no longer admiration, they were fire. Cassandra Green is everything wrong with America. Imagine throwing a fit next to Shaq of all people. Unfollowed. Never buying from her sponsors again. She dropped the phone into her lap, chest heaving as the cold truth set in. All those brand deals, the skincare endorsements, the fitness apparel partnerships built not just on audience size but on perception, on image, and now that image was scorched. Sponsors moved fast in the world of public opinion. By mid-morning, her inbox was filled with polite but unmistakable statements from PR reps and marketing managers. We're reevaluating our relationship with Cassandra Green, following recent events. Translation: we're done. She dialed her agent with shaking fingers. Elliot, you've seen it, right? Her voice cracked with panic. We need to fix this. Tell them I was provoked. Spin it. Say it was. Cassandra Elliot cut in, voice tight. The only advice I have right now is to apologize, publicly, and stay quiet. Any more posts, any more excuses. It's gasoline on the fire. But Cassandra didn't know how to stop. Her entire adult life had been motion climbing, curating, controlling the narrative. She wasn't built for retreat. She pulled up Instagram, thumb hovering over the live button, watching herself on the screen. Her face, usually flawless in every post, looked strained now, eyes puffy, lips trembling at the edges. She took a shaky breath, hit record and began. Hey guys, I just want to clear the air. Within minutes, the internet had dissected the live stream. They mocked her quivering voice, the carefully lit backdrop, the scripted "I'm learning from this language" that rang hollow. Screenshots flew across Twitter, spliced into side-by-side memes. Shaq handing out backpacks to kids, Cassandra clutching her phone, face pinched in frustration. Back in Florida, the town she once floated through with effortless dominance began to shift around her. At the coffee shop, baristas who used to fawn over her order barely made eye contact. Friends she'd brunch with sent vague texts. Hey, hope you're okay, crazy stuff online, then fell silent. One by one, the dinner invitations dried up. The social calendars erased her name. At the gym, eyes followed her not with admiration, but with barely disguised curiosity. Conversations quieted when she passed. Cassandra had always believed she could outrun scandal, rebrand, pivot, bounce back. But this wasn't just a PR problem. This was a reckoning. Meanwhile, Shaq's response rippled outward, a wave of grace against the tide of outrage. News outlets praised his restraint, his ability to rise above provocation, his effortless shift from potential conflict to community uplift. Headlines framed him as the quiet hero of the moment. Shaq turns confrontation into kindness. Big man, bigger heart. What America can learn from Shaquille O'Neal. Clips of Shaq unloading backpacks, hugging children, and laughing with parents saturated morning talk shows. Late-night hosts turned Cassandra's tantrum into punchlines, but always pivoted to Shaq's dignity. In a media landscape hungry for feel-good heroes, he was the perfect antidote to the internet's daily dose of outrage. Yet for Shaq, the praise sat heavy on his shoulders. In private, he confided in his mother, Lucille, as they sat together on a quiet evening. "Mama," he murmured, "it shouldn't take me standing still for the world to notice what's wrong." Lucille, always steady, squeezed his hand. "Maybe not, baby. But sometimes one moment shines so bright, it blinds people into finally seeing." For Cassandra, There was no such solace. Her world shrank with every hour. Her manager stopped returning calls. Her social media followers plummeted. Strangers she'd never met dissected her life in comment sections and podcasts, reducing her to a meme, a cautionary tale, a punchline. The curated life she had polished for years cracked like porcelain under a hammer, and no amount of deleting posts or issuing statements could glue it back together. But it wasn't just the loss of sponsorships or followers that hollowed her out. It was the realization that the town she had once ruled no longer looked at her with envy or admiration. She saw it in the way neighbors avoided her gaze, the way familiar faces looked through her at the grocery store, the way invitations once casually extended were now awkwardly withheld. And when she scrolled through her own feed, watching the relentless tide of reactions, it wasn't anger that finally surged in her chest. It was something darker, something she hadn't expected to feel: isolation. Shaq, on the other hand, didn't gloat. He didn't post about Cassandra. He didn't call out her behavior by name. His focus remained steady, on the kids, on the community, on the work. His silence toward her became its own kind of message, a quiet refusal to kick someone already crumbling. As days passed, the viral waves slowed, as all viral waves do, but the reputational damage remained. Cassandra sat in the stillness of her once bustling house, the quiet unnerving. For the first time in years, she had no event to prep for, no photo shoot to schedule, no collaborations to plan. All she had were her own thoughts, and the dawning realization that she was no longer the protagonist of her story. And somewhere across town, Shaq sat in the glow of a different kind of fame, the kind not measured in followers or likes, but in the quiet nods of respect from strangers, the soft thanks from parents, the unrecorded moments of goodness that no camera ever caught. Cassandra's fall was fast, but Shaq's rise, grounded in humility, was built to last. The soft hush of dusk settled over Shaq's backyard, the Florida sky melting from burnt orange to dusky purple. The world had quieted after days of headlines, hashtags, and media chatter. But inside Shaq, a restless hum remained. He sat on the patio, elbows resting on his knees, a rare stillness cloaking his towering frame. The laughter of children at the giveaway, the click of cameras, the murmur of reporters, all of it had faded. Yet one thing lingered: Cassandra's pale face behind the wheel of that Tesla, as she drove away, boxed in by her own mistakes. Shaq ran a hand over his shaved head, exhaling slowly. He had spent his life learning when to lean in and when to lean back. On the court, that balance had won him championships. Off it, it had guarded his peace. But tonight, something gnawed at him. Was the public shaming too much? Did the crowd's glee in watching Cassandra's downfall push past justice into cruelty? He wondered if in defeating her pride, they had also stripped away her chance to rebuild. With a sigh, Shaq rose, his joints groaning softly in protest, and grabbed his keys. There was one person whose counsel always cleared the fog in his mind. Lucille O'Neal opened the door before Shaq even knocked, her arms crossing as she leaned in the doorway with a knowing smirk. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her voice a mix of warmth and steel. "Come on in, baby." Inside, the house smelled like lavender, and something sweet baking in the oven. Shaq ducked slightly through the doorway, his massive form folding onto the familiar couch that had cradled him since his rookie days. Lucille settled beside him, hands folded neatly, eyes sharp and waiting. Shaq hesitated, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Mama, you see all this mess on the news?" Lucille gave him a pointed look, one brow lifting. "Boy, I've had neighbors stopping me at the grocery store asking what kind of magic you pulled out there." "Of course I've seen it." She leaned in, voice softening. "But you ain't here to brag, are you?" He shook his head, a heavy sigh slipping from his chest. "It's been weighing on me, Mama. I handled it cool, I know that. Didn't yell, didn't get pulled into the nonsense. But seeing that woman's face when she drove off, it hit different. Felt like the whole world clapped while she sank. And I'm wondering, did I teach her something or just break her down for show?" Lucille reached over, her hand warm against his. "Sometimes, baby, you gotta let folks fall. Not because you want to see them hurt, but because falling's the only thing that teaches them what standing means." She squeezed his hand gently. "But hear me, falling only teaches if they choose to stand back up." Shaq tilted his head back, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, his mother's words threading into his thoughts. Lucille had always been the voice behind his calm, the reason he hadn't lashed out as a younger man when faced with jeers or prejudice. She had taught him that dignity was its own form of resistance. But she had also taught him that dignity meant knowing when to offer a hand, not as a rescuer, but as a challenger. He turned toward her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You think she's got it in her? The bounce back? Lucille's gaze softened, a flicker of compassion warming her eyes. I think everybody's got the seed, baby. But whether they water it, that's on them. You just decide whether you're going to offer the water. For a moment, the house was quiet. The kind of hush that settles between two people who have said everything and nothing at once. Shaq let the quiet stretch, feeling the weight of choice settle into his chest. He could walk away, let Cassandra stew in her own mistakes, let the world move on to its next scandal. Or he could offer a gesture, one that might cost him nothing but could mean everything to someone standing at the edge of reckoning. As the oven timer beeped softly in the background, Lucille patted his knee and rose, heading toward the kitchen. You'll figure it out, baby. You always do. Just remember, grace ain't weakness. It's the strongest thing you got. Shaq lingered on the couch a few minutes longer after she left. Fingers laced, thoughts turning over and over like smooth stones in his palm. The public had already made up its mind about Cassandra, and honestly so had most of the town. But he knew firsthand the power of second chances. He had seen kids from hard streets rise because someone believed in them before they believed in themselves. He had seen teammates pull themselves from ruin because someone handed them a lifeline instead of a lecture. The next morning, Shaq sat at the community center, pen in hand, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. Volunteers bustled around him, cleaning up from the charity event, but his mind was elsewhere. He drafted a short message, then another, and finally settled on one that felt right. Not public, not performative, just a simple invitation. We're hosting volunteer days next week. You're welcome to join. No cameras, no posts, just real work. He sent it quietly, without fanfare, and leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Whether Cassandra responded or not wasn't his burden to carry. His role was simply to leave the door cracked open, to let grace be the last word instead of punishment. Lucille's words stayed with him through the afternoon. As the sun slipped lower, and the streets outside softened into evening quiet, Shaq found himself smiling, not the wide, camera-ready grin, but the small, private one that came from knowing he had done something not for applause but for peace. Across town, Cassandra sat alone, the glow of her laptop painting her face in blue light. When the message came through, she stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard, the weight of the invitation pressing against the raw edges of her pride. She didn't type anything back, not yet, but the message remained open on her screen, a quiet dare hanging in the stillness of her living room. And in that small, unfinished moment, something shifted, not a redemption arc, not a sudden transformation, but the first stirrings of accountability, waiting to be answered. Cassandra sat at her kitchen table, the cold morning light slanting across polished marble that suddenly felt as cold as the silence filling her house. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the invitation Shaq had sent glowing softly on her laptop screen. Volunteer days next. You're welcome to join. No cameras, no posts, just real work. It was so simple, so stripped of pretense, that it disarmed her. She had stared at it for nearly an hour, replaying every word of the message in her head, searching for an angle, a catch, a trap, but there was none. For days, Cassandra had been spiraling. Her social media had become a wasteland of lost followers. Sponsors had quietly severed ties, and her carefully constructed image was in ruins. Her public apology had landed with a thud, dissected, and dismissed by the same audience that once praised her. Friends she'd once considered close now responded to her text with terse one-liners or left her on read. The isolation was suffocating. But it was the realization that Shaq, of all people, had reached across the wreckage to offer her a hand that sent a fresh wave of disorientation washing through her. On the other side of town, Shaq moved through the community center, a quiet force of nature as volunteers stacked boxes, organized donations, and prepped for the next round of outreach. He had no idea if Cassandra would show, but that wasn't the point. Lucille's words still rang in his ears. Grace ain't weakness, baby. It's the strongest thing you got. He had chosen not to stand over Cassandra's fall, but beside it, leaving the door open without forcing her through it. As afternoon stretched into evening, Shaq was unloading a pallet of school supplies when he heard the hesitant crunch of tires on gravel. He turned, wiping his hands on a towel, as Cassandra's white Tesla crept into the lot. For a moment, she stayed behind the wheel, fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her posture betrayed her uncertainty. She had built an entire persona on control, on walking into rooms like she owned them. Now, stepping into this space felt like stepping into foreign territory. Shaq gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture free of pressure. The volunteers kept working, offering no special glances her way. Slowly, the driver's side door opened, and Cassandra emerged, dressed in jeans and a plain white t-shirt. No designer labels, no curated look, just a woman fumbling toward accountability. She crossed her arms tightly, as if bracing for a blow that didn't come. "I wasn't sure I should come," she muttered, her voice barely audible as she approached Shaq. Shaq simply smiled, broad and warm, the kind of smile that could crack tension like ice under sunlight. "Well, you're here now. That's a start." Cassandra exhaled, her posture sagging just slightly, as she glanced around at the bustling scene. Volunteers, many young and fresh-faced, moved with easy rhythm, laughing softly as they stacked supplies and sorted clothes. No one gawked, no one whispered behind her back. She was just another set of hands in a sea of movement, and that unfamiliar anonymity felt like both a blessing and a sting. For the first hour, Cassandra stumbled through the tasks, her hands unsure as she folded clothes and packed food boxes. Shaq watched her from across the room, never intervening, never announcing her presence, letting the work itself carry her weight. Slowly, the tight lines of her shoulders loosened. A young boy tugged at her sleeve, asking if he could help carry a bag, and for the first time that afternoon, a small, unguarded smile touched Cassandra's face. Shaq moved beside her quietly, handing her a box without ceremony. "Funny thing about work like this," he said casually. "You start thinking you're giving something, but pretty soon you realize it's what you're getting back that sticks." Cassandra looked at him, surprised by the lack of judgment in his tone, by the easy way he folded her into the flow without spotlighting her failures. As the day wore on, the small moments began to stack. A mother thanking Cassandra for helping her carry a stroller, a teen flashing a grin when she handed over a bag of groceries, an elderly man offering a quiet nod of appreciation. With each encounter, something in Cassandra shifted, not a dramatic epiphany, not a sweeping transformation, but a quiet recalibration, the slow realization that the pedestal she had once clung to was nothing compared to the ground-level connection unfolding around her. Later, as the sun dipped low, and the volunteers gathered for a quick meal, Cassandra found herself sitting on the community center steps, a paper plate balanced on her knees. Shaq eased down beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. For a moment, neither spoke, the comfortable hush of shared exhaustion settling between them. "I didn't know it would feel like this," Cassandra admitted softly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Most people don't," Shaq murmured, his voice low and steady. "But here's the thing, it ain't about fixing everything overnight, it's about showing up. Again and again." Cassandra swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. "I was awful to you," she whispered, the words tasting strange in her mouth. Shaq let the confession hang, then shrugged gently. "You were awful to yourself first." The truth landed with surprising gentleness, a weight that didn't crush but settled her firmly in place. For the first time, Cassandra realized that this wasn't a punishment, or even a redemption arc. It was a beginning, and beginnings, she understood now, were never earned with spin or strategy, only with the quiet, consistent act of showing up. As the volunteers packed up for the night, Cassandra lingered, helping with the last of the cleanup. She didn't ask for photos, didn't post a single update, didn't attempt to spin the experience into a PR recovery. She simply worked, and Shaq, watching from across the lot, felt a small satisfied ache bloom in his chest, not because he had saved her, but because he had offered her the one thing that had shaped his own life so profoundly, the chance to rise. In the end, the olive branch was never about erasing what had happened, but about building something better from the ruins. And in that twilight hour, as Cassandra stood a little straighter, a little steadier, the first stones of that new path were quietly laid beneath her feet. 10 Power restored. Lessons learned. 100 words. A week later, the afternoon sun hung soft and golden over a small, tucked-away charging station on the edge of town, its humming outlets busy with the quiet symphony of modern life. Shaq leaned against his SUV, arms folded easily across his chest, watching a middle-aged man fumble nervously with the unfamiliar charger in his hands. The man's forehead was creased in frustration, his phone clutched in one hand as he squinted at the charging instructions taped to the post. Shaq stepped forward, the ground beneath him almost whispering under his weight. "Need a hand, brother?" he asked, his voice calm, warm, and free of the slightest hint of condescension. The man glanced up, startled, and then a smile of surprised recognition bloomed across his face. "Wait, you're," he began, but Shaq raised a playful brow, cutting in with a grin. "I'm just a guy who's wrestled with a charger or two," he teased, gently taking the connector and guiding it into place. A satisfying click sounded, and the charger light shifted from red to green. The man let out a relieved laugh, clapping Shaq on the shoulder in thanks before heading off to wait in his car. Nearby, under the soft shade of a palm, Cassandra worked quietly at a folding table, sorting school supplies into neat piles. She wore jeans and a plain blue t-shirt, her hair tied back, a look of quiet concentration on her face, as she checked items off a clipboard. No one hovered around her with cameras. No one posed for selfies at her side. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Cassandra didn't care. The transformation hadn't come overnight. It was the slow, almost imperceptible shift that came from days spent shoulder to shoulder with people who expected nothing from her but effort. She had shown up at the community center the next day and the one after, quietly refusing the spotlight, gradually earning back a small measure of trust. And here, today, she worked side by side with the volunteers she had once dismissed as background noise. Her presence no longer a performance, but a contribution. Shaq watched her from a distance, a small flicker of satisfaction warming his chest. He hadn't known if she would take the invitation, hadn't known if the gesture would lead anywhere at all, but he'd offered it anyway, not because he needed to redeem Cassandra, but because he knew that sometimes, the real work happened in the small, unglamorous spaces, where reputations were built and rebuilt by quiet, repeated action. The lot hummed with energy, as families arrived to pick up donated goods, laughter mixing with the occasional bark of a dog, or the playful shrieks of children darting between cars. Shaq moved easily through the scene, helping where needed, offering a quick joke here, a gentle nudge there. His presence was still unmistakable. He was still Big Shaq after all, but it was less about who he was now, and more about what he was doing. As Cassandra finished setting up the last of the tables, she caught Shaq's eye across the lot. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to hold still, the noise and movement fading into a quiet moment of mutual recognition. She lifted a hand in a small wave, tentative but real, and Shaq responded with a nod that carried no trace of triumph, only acknowledgement. She had walked a long way to get here, and she had walked it herself. A young volunteer jogged over to Shaq, breathless and excited. "There's a family with a dead battery down the street," she said. "Think you can work your magic?" Shaq chuckled, his deep laugh rippling through the air like a low drumbeat. "Let's roll," he said, motioning toward his truck. Cassandra watched as he moved toward the road, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her mouth, a private understanding settling in her chest. It was in these moments, Shaq knew, that the real payback played out, not in public shaming or internet virality, but in transformation, in the slow rewiring of hearts and minds. Cassandra had been humbled, yes, but more importantly, she had been given space to choose what came next, and to his quiet satisfaction, she had chosen growth. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden fingers across the lot, Shaq took a brief pause, leaning back against his SUV. He watched the small swarm of people bustling across the pavement. Volunteers, families, strangers weaving in and out of one another's lives. He felt the familiar ache in his knees, the hum of tired muscles that had once been called on to dominate arenas, and now served something quieter but perhaps even more lasting. A little boy darted past, nearly colliding with Cassandra as she bent to pick up a box of canned goods. She steadied the box and reached out instinctively, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, murmuring a gentle reminder to watch his step. The boy grinned, wide and gap-toothed, before racing off again. Cassandra's eyes lifted, briefly locking with Shaq's across the lot, and in that simple exchange, the arc that had begun with entitlement and collapse found its closing note, not in grand speeches or orchestrated apologies, but in the gentle rhythm of repair. As evening softened the edges of the world, Shaq slid behind the wheel of his SUV, the battery now fully charged, the car humming quietly beneath his hands. He caught one last glimpse of Cassandra waving goodbye to a group of volunteers, her face lit with the kind of tired, honest satisfaction that came from work well done. No cameras followed her as she climbed into her car and eased out of the lot. The world would likely move on, the viral moment fading, the headlines shifting to the next spectacle. But Shaq knew that the real impact lingered, woven quietly into the lives they'd touched, the lessons learned, the current of empathy they'd sparked. As he pulled onto the road, the quiet Florida night stretching ahead, Shaq felt a sense of peace settle deep in his chest. Power restored, indeed, not just to the car beneath him, but to the people around him, to the battered but unbroken connections between strangers learning, little by little, how to be better. And in that simple truth, in the choice to lead with grace instead of grievance, Shaq knew he had delivered the most unforgettable payback of all. What would you do if the world was watching? Stay silent or stand for something bigger? Let Shaq's story remind you, the smallest choices can flip the script and change lives. Carry grace into your own world. Challenge entitlement with quiet strength, and watch how power truly shifts. Because sometimes the real victory isn't in winning, it's in lifting someone else to stand.